So I am here to talk to you about a project I'm working on with the economic historian Deirdre McCluskey titled "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich: How the Bourgeois Deal Made the Modern World." But I'll begin by talking about a revolutionary. And the revolutionary was giving a revolutionary speech, trying to revolutionize the people and trying to gear them up for revolution. And he talked about how after the revolution, everything will be great. Everybody will be educated. Everybody will be smart. Everybody will have enough to eat. After the revolution, work will be easy. After the revolution, work will be brief. After the revolution, we will live long lives. After the revolution, the land will flow with milk and honey. From the middle of the crowd, someone spoke up and said, what if we don't like milk and honey? And the revolutionary thought for a second and said, comrade, after the revolution, you will like milk and honey. Okay? And this gets to a central question about, I think, the economic way of thinking and how it relates to the questions that we ask, the decisions that we make in societies, the choices we make in markets, and the choices we make in politics, and in particular, the decisions people make and the actions they undertake in a market versus the decisions they make and the actions they undertake when they have control of a state. One of my favorite quotes is from Adam Smith, or one of my favorite characters from Smith is the gentleman in the theory of moral sentiments he calls the man of system, who is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and who imagines he can move around the members of a great society with the same ease with which he moves around pieces on a chessboard. Or a modern analog, the man of system today might be someone who sees society as a giant Lego set, where everything fits together exactly the way he wants it to, and he can build the exact society that he wants. Okay, and in this case, when the man of system, or when the revolutionary substitutes his discretion for everybody else's, it's not immediately clear that we get the outcome that we want. That has something to do with some transportation innovations. Imagine this. Imagine being able to hire someone in their private car to pick you up, drive you to pretty much wherever you want to go, drop you off, and do so at a bargain rate relative to all of the alternatives. That sounds an awful lot like the debate that we're having in the world today about Uber, Lyft, sidecar, and ride sharing. But that's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about something that came 100 years ago. In 1914, 1915, car prices fell dramatically. And a lot of people actually were pushed out of work with the sort of war mobilization and things like that happening in the middle of the decade. And with car prices falling and with the labor supply increasing, a lot of entrepreneurial people bought cars or borrowed money to buy cars and started driving jitneys. And basically the way the jitney would work is you drive along in your car and someone flags you down and says, I need to get to wherever. So they pick you up at the Aztec Theater, say, I need to get to the Alamo. So you put a little sign in your window that says, going to the Alamo. Anybody else who's going to the Alamo hops on, pays you a nickel, and you're good. So it's like the Uber of 100 years ago. This worked extremely well. It worked too well. It worked so well that the streetcar companies got very upset. Very upset, much like the taxi drivers have gotten very upset in the Uber world. And so what did they do? In the name of public safety, of course, they lobbied local regulators to crack down on the jitney drivers, because after all, you don't know who you're getting in a car with. You might have heard that argument before. You know, it could be a serial killer or someone like that. You know, they're driving recklessly. Once again, same argument that we've heard in the Uber debate and the Uber discussion. Again, all in the name of public safety. That brings us to what Deirdre McCluskey and I are writing about, the Bourgeois Deal. Professor McCluskey has published 2 books and is publishing a third. Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce, published in 2006. Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World, published in 2010. Bourgeois Equality, Why Idea is Not Capital, and then ideally, in time to meet all of your holiday shopping needs for 2016, McCluskey and Carden, volume 3.5 of this series, I think, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich: How the Bourgeois Deal Made the Modern World, a condensation of her overall argument with a handful of additional examples and things like that, by 1, by 2, by 10, and spread the gospel of price-making markets to those on your shopping list. So what do we mean by the bourgeois deal? Well, the better part of history was characterized by what McCluskey calls the Aristocratic Deal. And the Aristocratic Deal says, according to Professor McCluskey, basically, honor me, an aristocrat by birth and blood, because I'm of the Hartsville, Alabama Cardens, descended from the Sledges of Elgin Crossroads, Alabama, fancy and noble places, the ancestral birthplace of gods and kings, North Alabama. Honor me by blood and birth, a natural superior to you. Pay your taxes, curtsy when I tell you, bow, don't go elsewhere in the market for protection, and by the time all's said and done, I will not have slaughtered you. Maybe. That's a world in which Henry VIII and the people in his court were eating 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, in a world where the peasants were starving, and the king was so fat that he couldn't move without assistance. Beginning in about 1500 or so, and it's, Joel Mokyr, my academic grandfather, advisor of one of my advisors, is working on a book about the changing intellectual culture of Europe. He argued that Europe started to integrate intellectually while it was fragmented politically. So you had a transnational republic of letters where people are trading ideas in this marketplace for ideas, this very competitive marketplace for ideas across Europe that was sufficiently politically fragmented that if the noble in one place didn't like you, you could move somewhere else. And hence we had Thomas Hobbes writing in Paris, John Locke writing in Amsterdam, publication happening right across the border of various heretical works, an explosion of an intellectual culture, a belief among the elites now in the possibility of progress and the desirability of progress that gave rise to a new esteem for innovation and a new esteem for ordinary bourgeois life. Where previously the merchants had been disdained, Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, for example, they came to be at least tolerated in the middle of the 18th century, into the 19th century in Europe, and we got this explosion that we call the Great Enrichment. And the Bourgeois Deal basically says, leave me alone and I'll make you rich. Not in an antisocial way, but in a, look, I've got an idea. Let me try this idea. I think we can do this better. Let me try that. Let me enjoy the profits from my innovation. I'll take responsibility for the losses. I am willing to admit that there's going to be competition, but by the time all is said and done, I'll have made some money, we'll all be rich. Now then, it's a deal that's not always credible, because the first thing that an innovative and rich bourgeoisie is going to do once they become rich is try to stop all of their competition. But for the most part, we've overcome the rent-seeking society to a sufficient degree that we enable and indeed encourage trial, error, and innovation, such as, let's try this thing. We'll call it an iPad. 2010, the iPad comes out. Steve Jobs announces it the same day that Barack Obama gives his State of the Union address. And apart, making bathroom humor jokes about the iPad, a lot of people were saying, well, what are we going to use this thing for? What's it for? And some people are like, I don't know. And now I can't imagine life without an iPad. To my kids, there have always been iPads. Of course, you can access any piece of information or any picture of any cat that's ever existed just by swiping and tapping. Let's try this thing. We'll call it an iPad. And it was remarkably successful. Doesn't always work. Even when you have the market research on your side. Let's try this thing. We'll call it New Coke. Every marketing textbook in America has this as one of the ultimate examples of a complete and total entrepreneurial failure. Absolute disaster for the Coca-Cola company. Not to be outdone, several years later, Pepsi said, you know what? If people like soft drinks, they like cola, but you know what they would really like? Clear cola. Let's call that Crystal Pepsi. Met roughly the same end as New Coke, though it had better commercials featuring a Van Halen song. 1928, Chillicothe, Missouri. Some guy says, you know what, let's try this thing. Let's call it sliced bread. Okay? And it's the greatest thing since something, but it's really, really cool. We'll call it sliced bread. Okay? And indeed, this was a massive hit, a huge hit. Housewives all over the country said, this makes our lives so much easier because we don't have to spend so much time slicing bread. And indeed, who do you think could possibly be against it? Well, in reading the Wikipedia article about sliced bread, I was directed to this article in the New York Times during World War II. Bread slicing ban extended further. Bakeries and delicatessens are ordered to discontinue use of their machines. No pastry is returnable. Conaboy says he is ready to take stern measures against violators of regulations. Okay. Now then, we're all economists. We can tell non-crazy stories about why this might possibly in some universe be appropriate, but when we look at this is, we can recognize, yeah, there's a war on at the time, but really? Really, do we absolutely positively need to be going after the sliced bread manufacturers for wasting resources? I'm sure this Conaboy chap was industrious, was very smart, was very bright, very hard worker. Might we have better used our resources having him, say, in the Pacific theater or the European theater instead of having him go after the sliced bread manufacturers? Fortunately, the story has a happy ending. The story has a happy ending because we lived still in a relatively competitive market for goods, a relatively competitive market for services, and a relatively competitive market for ideas. And people were able to rise up and say, no, sliced bread is not some frippery, it's not some wasteful thing. It in fact makes our lives better. It has passed a market test because the companies that make it are making money. And fortunately, as with many price controls, bans on sliced bread went the way of the dodo after World War II. Institutions matter. I was a student of Douglass North at Washington University in St. Louis, so that's pretty much my entire graduate career is institutions matter. And I teach from a textbook by Alex Tabarrok and Tyler Cowen. One of the things I like about that book is their emphasis on institutions in the chapter on economic development. They list 5 institutional factors that lead to economic growth: secure property rights, honest government, political stability, a dependable legal system, and open and competitive markets. That last one I think is really important because on one hand, we can have the rules that say markets are open and competitive, and that's fantastic. But we also need to have a set of cultural prerequisites, perhaps, whereby people are not honored merely for testing their ideas about a better world on the battlefield, but honored for testing their ideas about a better world in the marketplace as judged by consumers and consumers' willingness to pay. Again, McCluskey and Carden, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Made the Modern World, forthcoming ideally in 2016. I have 3 small children who are very hungry, and I'm sure you're going to have Christmas shopping to do next year.